very special guest in the ICRIER podcast today, former ambassador to Washington and Beijing, High Commissioner in Sri Lanka, former Foreign Secretary, first woman spokesperson for India's Foreign Office, Ambassador Nirupama Rao. She's also a member in the ICRIER board. Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming to the ICRIER podcast.
Thank you so much, Puja, for having me. It's good to be here.
Ma'am, we want to request you to help us understand a few recent developments. The White House has imposed a 50% tariff on imports from India. President Donald Trump has made some very rough statements about India's economy. None of this was expected. In fact, what was expected was that India and US would sign a trade deal, and that this would be the very first deal that would be announced. And there were many reasons to have these expectations. The two sides were making statements that suggested this since the day the Liberation Day tariffs were announced in April. The chemistry between President Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, also the growing India-US relations in the decades preceding Prime Minister Modi's tenure. So what has just happened? Why have things sort of spiraled down so much? And, if you could just tell us why it has suddenly become so difficult to negotiate with President Trump.
So if I were to distill your question, basically what you're asking me is what just happened, what has hit India, and why has negotiating with the White House become so difficult, right? So let me answer by saying that first and foremost, I think two things collided. First, of course, on 2nd April, President Trump launched his Liberation Day tariff regime, as we all know, a 10% baseline on virtually all imports, with the power to hike rates country by country under a self-declared national emergency authority. And you can question the validity of that. And secondly, on the 27th of August, the White House slapped a 50% tariff on a large set of Indian goods, justifying it as punishment for India's continued purchases of Russian oil. And I use the word punishment carefully. And that's the direct hit Indian exporters, particularly in labor-intensive sectors, are now feeling. And why are negotiations hard at the moment with the US? And I'll give three reasons for that. Excuse me. First and foremost, a very centralized, leader-driven bargaining from the American side in particular. Deliverables have to be visible and fast, or the dial moves to punishment, and that's the Trumpian style. Trump even claimed that India offered, quote, zero tariffs, unquote, on some US goods, illustrating the deal or hit style. Secondly, there's a legal flux today. United States Appeals Court has questioned the legality of these emergency tariffs, and the White House has been rushing to the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, to keep them alive. And that kind of uncertainty narrows the room for compromise. And thirdly, politics equals policy. The tariff program for the US under the Trump administration is a domestic show of strength, and personal chemistry between Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump cannot outweigh the MAGA audience in the amphitheater. So that's my take on what you asked me.
Ma'am, President Trump has, of course, also made some very unreasonable demands of Europe, of Japan, South Korea, countries with which the US has had free trade agreements. And he's had his way, as you described, with most of these countries. So does this tell us that massaging President Trump's ego is a prerequisite now in dealings with White House?
Well, I think, in my view, while everybody has talked about the ego factor in diplomacy vis-a-vis the United States today, not just for India, but for the rest of the world too, in my estimate, and based on my experience and my understanding of these matters, I think flattery can buy you minutes, it can buy you time, but I don't think it can buy you outcomes. And outcomes have to come from deliverables that can be claimed as wins, as Mr. Trump calls it, in US politics. Market access in a few visible lines, energy purchases from the US, and joint announcements for all this. Now, India could only, I think, have blunted the blow by sequencing tangible offers earlier. But the core shift that you're seeing today is very structural. A tariff first doctrine, which is now under legal challenge, and a doctrine that treats even friends as competitors. So the sudden change, if you can call it that, in terms of what Mr. Trump has been saying, looks more like a reversion and like a confirmation of Mr. Trump's preferred playbook, the way, he's done business through the years and his art of the deal. So once the new tariff machinery went live, it's now what you're going to see is the Trumpian playbook in action.
The Trumpian playbook suggests that is this a personality issue, or is this a reset in times, a reset moment?
I think it's both, if you ask me. The style is definitely Mr. Trump's. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he's a true original. They made him and broke the mold, literally. But the substance is very hard-edged geoeconomics, and that is now embedded in the process. Now, the analogy that comes to mind is Henry Kissinger's realism without the soft edges. Mr. Kissinger spoke in his book Diplomacy in 1994, immediately after the Cold War had ended, saying that there would be no blocks between nations. There would be only competitors in the fray. And that's what Mr. Trump, I think, is trying to exercise, that theory in terms of practice. So in the near term, you can expect iterative deals like sector exemptions, energy quid pro quos, layered over with a persistent baseline tariff, unless courts, of course, force a rethink. But in the medium term, what you're going to see is a more transactional world where countries will have to diversify partners and reduce single market exposure, India included.
I'll come to what the Trumpian world may look like and what you expect it to be like. But first, I want to ask you, in what is obviously a very bad situation, could India have done something differently to not let it get so bad?
Well, I think nobody expected things to turn out the way they have, as they have today. It's like, this is a spiraling situation. And you've seen that happening not just with India. I mean, you look at the way the United States is treating Brazil, for instance, and the way they started off with China. And then, of course, he dialed down the noise. And Mr. Trump is now talking about meeting Xi Jinping and how great China is. And obviously, there are certain indispensabilities about China that the Americans recognize, that Mr. Trump recognized, and he has kind of calibrated his approach on that basis. So in a sense, what he's doing is he is defining your place in the scheme of things. And in his arithmetic of things, he has placed India in a very different place from China, in a very different position from China. So what do we do in this context? I think we are facing the gravitational pull of all this great power competition. And for a country like India, which is really, a threshold nation, a nation waiting to join the front line of big powers, a nation whose GDP is growing, which wants to become a developed nation by 2047. So we're in this very, very in-between world where we have to constantly adjust our positions. We have to understand there is no single vendor here. We will have to really diversify our choices, deepen the optionalities available to us, and really pursue a policy dictated by interests, even more than values.
Staying with the US relationship, do you think a flaw has been put underneath the downward spiral in ties, or could it deteriorate further?
I think that, despite the kind of the feeling you have, the injury, the sense of injury and hurt by all that Mr. Trump has been saying, he's been heaping insults literally upon India. But I believe that if you look at the relationship between our two democracies, there's a lot of ballast in the system also. You look at defense, you look at technology, you look at Indo-Pacific coordination, you look at our diaspora in the United States. There is ballast, but there is no guaranteed flaw, because now you're seeing the tariff fight is in court, and the White House prizes pressure as leverage. It's all about leverage. So I think you can expect more frictionary, very kind of unpleasant, let us say, salvos, and then haggling towards carve-outs. A lot of acrimony above, a lot of acrimony in the atmosphere, but I believe the ballast below will still sustain this relationship as the legal picture clarifies itself.
Now, do you expect some of these other areas of interests and some of India's other interests to remain untouched in this sort of equation?
No, what I'm saying is that the challenge for us is to, play that game of strategy. Like the Chinese have this game called Go. It's not exactly chess. It is again how you deal with your opponent, how you prevent your opponent from circling you. Instead, try and circle your opponent. So it's that constant game of strategy between the two sides. And here I believe you have certain sectors in the relationship, like you have defense, you have technology, that is very, very important for you. And you have to protect that. You have to kind of ring fence that. And then you have the issue of the trade, which may be at the center of all these differences between us. You'll have to see how you can cover for that. How are you going to create a situation where you're able to diffuse tensions on that and come to some understandings? It will be a process of give and take. And the Americans are going to put a lot of pressure on you, but you will have to be able to defend your interests and at the same time be able to provide certain offers and an outreach that is able to assuage some of their concerns. I mean, Mr. Trump keeps talking of high tariffs. Of course, he's exaggerating, but certainly that is an area we will have to pay attention to. And then there's a core of the relationship, which is the bipartisan consensus that has sustained this relationship for so long, the bipartisan consensus in the United States Congress, and then the very, very well-placed, perhaps not completely, and has the diaspora in the United States has still to reach that level of influence in the way the Jewish diaspora in the United States is able to exercise interests on behalf of Israel. That has not yet happened with our diaspora, but they're still in very high-placed positions, and they have really mainstreamed themselves into American life. So I think those are the core areas of the relationship also that you need to protect. So, when you talk of the flaw in the relationship, yes, the flaw is really, in a sense, moving under us. But we have to be able to make the strategic moves that, as I said, preserve the ballast in this relationship.
For those of us, ma'am, who don't understand foreign policy as well, what do you think we should watch, just so that we have some sense of the developments as they unfold, which will signal to us what's going on?
So, you're dealing, I think you had also mentioned this, with an irrational superpower. And this is a world of permanent bargaining that you are today living in. Tariffs are going to be routine policy. There will be lawfare over executive authority. And alliance politics in a Trumpian world are going to be measured in invoices. I mean, the whole global marketplace is going to be treated as an auction. So the rational response is collective de-risking. You diversify trade routes, you build issue-based coalitions. We have the G20, we have the Quad, BRICS, SEO, and you maintain redundant supply chains. So don't mistake theater. I mean, in the world of social media, everything becomes theater. Don't mistake theater for strategy. And you answer pressure with practical deliverables, what you are able to make, and quiet counter leverage. I think that's the way forward for countries like ours.
My next question was, in fact, going to be to request you to describe what the Trumpian world may look like over the next few years. But uh, some people say that Trumpism will outlast President Trump. What is your view on that? Is the world going to now change for a considerable period of time and remain the way it's shaped? Tariffs are, of course, just one tool, but there are so many other elements to the way he does. He goes about viewing the world and dealing with the world. Will some of those elements outlast him?
I think transactionalism and uncertainty are really going to be signposts for the times, and we should be prepared for that. And this is not an unfamiliar world for us. Global politics and transactionalism has always been a part of diplomacy. It's not all sweetness and light. It never has been. I would compare the world's situation today. The analogy that comes to mind is the metaphor of an orchestra that is falling apart. Yeah, if you have watched, and I highly recommend that you can put it in your show notes. You think of the Federico Fellini film from 1978. It's called Orchestra Rehearsal, and it's all about an orchestra where a rebellion has broken out. Nobody is listening to the conductor. He is sitting in a corner with his head between his hands, wondering what to do next. And every section in the orchestra, the orchestra, like multilateralism and like nations coming together, is held up by various sections. And each section is playing its own music. And I think that's really what multipolarity today is about. There is a discordance about what you see. There is a chaos all around you because the world order, as we have known it since 1945 and even after the Cold War, I think is really, really, subject to a lot of fissures and tremors at the moment. So as this orchestra, this image of an orchestra where every section is playing its own music, the percussion people particularly are creating a lot of noise. So there's so many drum beats of discordance. And this is the situation you're going to deal with until things settle down. And in the near term, I believe, even if Mr. Trump goes away, he has put in motion certain trends that were perhaps latent for a very, very long time. Even if you talk about, the discontent about globalization, and you talk about the rise of a country like China, the whole, Thucydides trap that Graham Allison at Harvard spoke about a few years ago, about comparing it to what happened between Athens and Sparta, the emergent struggle between the US and China. And then you have Russia. That's the third pole in some ways. The embrace of China by Russia and Russia by China. And the leverage that Mr. Trump is trying to exert in that direction. So when you look at all this, I feel India is on a tightrope trying to balance itself. There's a lot of chaos underneath, a roaring crowd underneath, and you're trying to strike the right balance, because what is of essence and what is absolutely crucial and vital for a country like ours, which has miles to go in order to achieve that developed nation status is to focus on our immediate concerns, our immediate interests, and our immediate wants, and to be able to devise the best solutions that ensure that despite all this chaos around us, we stay on course and we do not really deviate in terms of the goals that we've set for ourselves. So in a sense, you can use something that you use, a term that you use in geophysics. You're trying to achieve that Lagrange position, trying to resist the gravitational pull of these major planets, these major countries like the United States and China particularly, and to some extent Russia, because we have strong relations with the United States. We've had a history of very strong relations with Russia, and China is an immediate neighbor of ours. It's a very crucial country in the calculus of our foreign and strategic and security relations. So finding the right balance, I think, will be the challenge.
Sam, in your analogy, the conductor, nobody's listening to him, but President Trump is sort of making sure that everybody is listening to him.
Yeah, but is everybody listening to him is the question, of course. But I brought up the analogy of the orchestra, saying that, a world order needs that kind of unity, that kind of unity in diversity. And that has fallen apart. Never mind who the conductor is. I mean, there will be several conductors trying to assume roles for themselves. But the best conductor is the conductor who's able to hold all these elements together. And I think that is missing at the moment.
Ma'am, do you see any of the countries like in Europe or in Japan? I mean, who's going to be able to play this role? They're all right now sort of throwing their lot with what President Trump is doing. At least that's the impression we get from the deals he has signed.
Well, I think everybody is waiting and watching. Everybody is calibrating their positions. Everybody is trying to get the best deal for themselves because you have a leader in the White House who follows a winner-take-all strategy, and that obviously is not suitable for the rest of the world because you need bargaining and you need negotiating and you need fair and reasonable solutions. So we're all in the same. I think we're all in the same position, especially our friends and partners like Japan. Now, Prime Minister Modi went to Japan just before his visit to Tianjin for the SCO summit. And, the image of him taking that ride on the Shinkansen train with Prime Minister Ishiba, I think was more than just speed. It was about constancy. It was about constancy in the relationship between India and Japan. So we have to reach out to our traditional friends and partners, particularly, countries like Japan.
Like you said, Prime Minister Modi's just attended a summit in China, his first visit to China in 7 years, and of course, after the severe tensions on the border. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar has said that the way this visit and the recent sort of change in complexion of relations with China should not be viewed as linked to what are the developments that have been going on with the US. And that this is being done to a timeline that predates what's going on with the US. I suppose he's referring to what happened in December, where some sort of settlement was announced between India and China for some of the border flashpoints. But how do you see this sort of change of equation with China?
What we saw happening with China last year was disengagement. It was not really a settlement because settlement has a note of finality about it. It would suggest that, we have sorted out our problems and the halcyon days are back again. I think what we are aiming for China is stability in the relationship. Just as, we were able to achieve disengagement along the line of actual control in Ladakh, that counts for stability and you have to build on that, what are you going to do about de-escalation? Because that line is still very heavily militarized. So you have to call what we're doing with China at the moment an effort to restore equilibrium and stability in the relationship. Mutual trust is still at a very, very low point. I think you see a lot of optics, certainly, when the leaders of the two countries meet each other. There are practical resets happening, like, the agreement to resume direct flights, for instance, easing the Kailash Mansarovar pilgrimages, reopening some border trade. But still, underlying all this is the absence of mutual trust and a situation along the line of actual control that could still is still very, very delicate and sensitive. It's been but I personally think it is a positive development that at the political level, the leaderships of the two countries are reaching out to each other. They are in contact. They are communicating. There are conversations going on. Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, was here a few days ago, and there were some outcomes announced following his discussions with our government in Delhi, which all point to these efforts to restore equilibrium and to de-risk, really, the relationship. But, we have critical dependencies on China on the trade front. Our trade deficit with China is still, it's something that needs to be addressed, but it has to be addressed in two ways. It has to be addressed by the Chinese, of course, by their being able to do more in terms of getting their trade with India to be more dynamic, to enable a much larger flow of imports from India into China. But on our side, I think we have to look at our dependencies on China and to see how we can reduce them in the near and medium term. And that is something also of crucial importance. So while we are riding out this trade turbulence with the United States, we have to be able to look at how we can enable tactical de-risking with China also. So certainly this is not going to be a strategic embrace of China. It's a question of how we provide for stability in that relationship, because we have this long border, this unsettled border with China. China is our biggest neighbor, and China is a peer competitor for India. And we have a lot to do in terms of reducing the power asymmetry between India and China today. India particularly has to address that.
In fact, on the imbalance in the economic relationship, our colleagues at ICRIER have just put out a study which puts out the details on and the characteristic of this imbalance and also how it may be addressed. One of the points they've made is that, perhaps being more open to FDI from China could help, because that sort of reduces dependencies and vulnerability to political decisions in China. But having said that, ma'am, you've served in China, but to those of us who know very little about foreign policy, it seems sometimes that India's relationship with China over the past few decades has sort of been by and large dictated by Beijing. Is the impression that some of us who do not know much about foreign policy we get. How do you view the relationship?
No, I don't think the terms are being set by Beijing. I mean, that would be a response that is, a statement that is some kind of acknowledgement of weakness or shortcoming on India's part. I don't think that's the case, but there are certain realities. I spoke about the power asymmetry between India and China. I mean, look at it in terms of our economies, in terms of our GDP, in terms of the trade that each country carries on with the rest of the world, military strength, levels of development. So this is really, I mean, just using the mantra, the terms are set by Beijing is not going to get us anywhere. I'm sorry to say that. The weight that Beijing exerts has set many of the terms of trade. It's reflected in a persistent Indian trade deficit and our dependence on critical inputs. But I recall a time 30 years ago when we made our own pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs and things. And today, much of it comes from China. There's a lot of introspection to be done by India in terms of trying to understand all the shortcomings that have crept into our trading system and the lack of manufacturing capacity that is able to match the challenge from China. I think these are the things. This should be our Damascus moment, really, not by blaming the Chinese for all that has happened to us, or by just saying, they're so much more powerful than us, they're going to set the terms. I don't think that can provide a solution for what we need to do. I think at the same time, nonetheless, I'll say that the line that the government is pursuing now in terms of China policy seems to be a rational one. You're trying to set in place guardrails at the border along the LAC. You want to provide for economic stabilization. You may start with limited areas, but where it's necessary and useful, you should be doing that. And you have to de-risk gradually the vulnerable supply nodes. So in many ways, we're not the elephant and the dragon. And that's one of the tropes that is used very frequently to describe this relationship. I would picture India more as a kind of archer on an iceberg, which is moving between our feet. And we have to be very careful about how we can ensure stability. And we should never mistake détente with China for friendship.
In fact, ma'am, much of the world, including the US, before President Trump's time, has complaints against China on the way they do trade, on how they do not follow the rules of the game. For instance, how they gained trade, the way they subsidize, the way they manage the exchange rate, which gives them unfair advantage, which is what has given them such large market share in global trade, how they're able to lower costs, and how they sort of captured pretty much large part of the global trade, leading up to some of the political unease in much of the Western world today. Which one way of that is showing up is in the politics and the rise of leaders such as President Trump and his rhetoric and his politics. And perhaps that's also one of the reasons why India cannot trust China. So then how does one go about managing this relationship?
I've told you, I've answered that question. I've told you about the need for stability, the need for de-risking, the need to reduce critical dependencies, and to keep open the channels of communication. The situation doesn't ease by turning our backs on each other, but don't set your expectations too high. This is not going to be a détente that turns into friendship, or the old bhai framework that people spoke of in the 50s and early 60s. So go into this process without illusions, be hard-nosed about it, and understand that it's a transactional world you're dealing with. The Chinese are transactional, the Americans are transactional. The world is going to seek leverage wherever it can. There are going to be hard bargains involved. So don't join a parade of illusions. And it's easy, of course, to throw the blame at the Chinese, but the blame doesn't stick, when you're powerful and when you are influential. And I think that's a hard lesson that India has to learn. And I think there is need for a lot of soul searching and looking inwards, but not acting inwards. I don't think we can afford insularity. Of course, we need to build self-reliance in critical areas, but we also need to be open to the world because we need the technology, we need the capital, we need the investment, we need the trade from countries other than the US. And there's a whole linkage with the global South where we're well poised to exert more leverage and to be able to bring together issue-based coalitions. So it's not a free glide anyway. It's not going to be, the Chinese are responsible for all our woes. I think they are to some extent. Certainly, they've gamed the system to their advantage. But the fact is also that there is a lot of hard work that we have to do. Look at the share of manufacturing in our GDP. Why hasn't that big opening come up? And these are areas where I think we can do much, much more, and turn the tide in our favor. So if we have to really improve our position on the global stage and the position for our country really in terms of our progress, I think there's a lot of work to be done here where we are in terms of our policies and in terms of implementation of our policies and in terms of consistency of policy and in making India a much more easy place for foreign investment to come in, for people to do business, and ensuring that transformation that China was able to achieve. I mean, I remember a time going to China in the 80s when, India and China seemed to feel and look and act so similar. The feel of the place, the smell of the place was so similar. But they have leapfrogged, miles ahead of us. And I think, it's not just a question of blaming them. It's, I think we have to benchmark ourselves in a way that says, here's a country next door that has been able to achieve much. And why haven't we been able to do similarly well?
In fact, one of your former colleagues once said to me that 8% GDP growth is India's best foreign policy. But now, in the context of what you're saying, we often hear of India's strategic autonomy and multi-alignment. How does this sort of sit in the Trumpian world? In the Trumpian era, is this going to be easy for us to follow, or will there be costs?
I think we will have to be consistent. Yes, a policy of strategic autonomy is very important for India in the current situation. Multi-alignment makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, as I said before, it's not a free glide. It's not going to be a smooth glide. It's also station keeping. You have to maintain your position, ensure you do not go off course, that you are in the orbit that is best suited for your interests. So with the United States, you'll have to ring fence the trade fights from the defense and technology pillars. You'll have to offer targeted market access and energy buys to unlock tariff relief. With China, you have to hold the line on the line of actual control, the border, or the border where you don't have too many problems. Resume only low-risk economic links and cut dependence on critical inputs. That's important. And with Russia, you have to keep functional ties, whether it's defense spares, whether it's energy, but you also have to avoid the sanction tripwires that, the Americans particularly may set for you. So the cost of all this, the expenditure, if I may call it that, to be incurred, is a constant juggling. And, people may accuse you of inconsistency. Be prepared for that. But don't let it get under your skin. I think you have to be constantly juggling. And the payoff for India is to ensure that room to maneuver in a very turbulent world. So that is really where we are at the moment. There's a lot of acrimony that we see around us, but there is ballast also for India where these relationships are concerned. So strategic autonomy today is that orbital station keeping. And your rocket boosters have to constantly be burning, small burns to hold the position. It's like, think of yourself as that spacecraft where the booster rockets have to, have these small burns, small thrusts in order to enable you to hold your position. So as I said, to sum up, let me say that India is walking like an archer on an iceberg with China, every step carefully done. and stability to be ensured, and trust is not going to really define this relationship. But we are parked at a kind of Lagrange point between America and China. We are keeping balance through that constant orbital station keeping. And our foreign policy is, really, if you look at it in these civilizational terms, it's like a river with many tributaries. It's adaptive. It is civilizational rather than doctrinal. It's flowing through very difficult terrain, but it's carving its own course. The world around us resembles Fellini's orchestra. It's very discordant, it's very improvised, there's no single conductor. And in that noisy hall, President Trump's red lines, the red lines that he issues or draws from the Oval Office every day, are echoing in this global amphitheater. And you see a lot of machismo around, a lot of leaders in the world today seem to exude that kind of machismo that wins applause at home, but is creating turbulence abroad. So we have to juggle these contradictions. And, there has to be prudence, there has to be purpose, there has to be patience. Because until, this discordant music that we see around us resolves into something closer to order, this is going to be the everyday for us.
Last question, you spoke of red lines by President Trump. Do you see a risk of sanctions and perhaps, something perhaps also from Europe on that front?
I think I've already explained my situation and my approach to this, that you will have to continue, to protect those guardrail, ring fence those areas in the relationship with the United States that are important to you. I think there is much more understanding in Europe of our position. I think the pressure that we are facing is essentially from the White House on a lot of these issues. I think this is also a moment to strengthen and deepen and expand our outreach to Europe, to conclude the FTAs that are still to be concluded, to really build, that leverage and insurance that we need in a situation like this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.